Once it was seen as an impossible dream, but now the sub-2-hour marathon is within touching distance of the world's best runners.
Incredible. In November, Kenya's Dennis Kimeto broke the marathon world record with a time of 2 hours, 2 minutes and 57 seconds. That was in Berlin. And the big question now is, can the sub-2-hour marathon become a reality? And who will be the first athlete to do it?
Ed Caesar has looked for answers to those questions in his new book called 2 Hours, The Quest to Run the Impossible Marathon. He's been to see how the very best runners in the world train to enable them to push themselves to the very limit. So how does the 2 hour marathon rank in the pantheon of great sporting achievements?
It is the 4-minute mile. It is the ascent of Everest. It is this first sub-10 100 metres. All of those moments encapsulated really why we watch sport, which is to see what we're capable of. And the 2 hour marathon is one of those big Everest-type moments in sport. And whatever the science or the physiology behind it, we're very close in terms of time. And it's going to be very hard to escape that conversation as the world record comes down.
It's tantalising, isn't it? And as I now know from our previous conversation off air that you're a betting man, do you have any idea when it will be? Do you think?
I am not going to make myself look very foolish, so I'm going to give you what cleverer people than me think, which is that 2025 to 2035 is not a completely ridiculous range. But really, it's about what happens to the sport. So at the moment, it's very hard to break a world record because there's very few opportunities to do so. You know, most world records are broken in Berlin, which happens once a year in September. And if you have a bad day in Berlin, the world record isn't getting broken.
Why can't it happen anywhere else?
It could happen. It could happen elsewhere, but Berlin's particularly fast. Very flat. They set it up for fast times. The pacemakers are particularly good. It's well organised. It's just a race that's structured so that people can break the world record. And other races tend to be more like real races, where if you and I try to race each other to the end of the street, we try and run the legs off each other and we'd try to do all sorts of things to win. It's not just a question of running fast. Berlin is really, really set up for the benefit of one or two really fast athletes to see what they can do.
In 1986, there was a medical student called Mike Joyner who tried to work out how fast it could be run. And this was really interesting to me. I'd never heard of his testing before. What did he find?
He ran figures for a number of things that restrict marathon running speed. Things like lactate threshold and lung size.
Now, lactate threshold for a non-sporting person.
Okay.
So take it back.
So what he's doing is he's asking the question of what stops us running faster? Like, why can't we keep on running faster? And the things are, our muscles can't do it, our heart can't do it, our lungs can't do it. At a very simple level, that's what we're talking about. There are limits to the organs and the faculties of our body that stop us from running so fast, even if we're kind of perfect athletes. And what Mike Joyner found was that if you put in the best possible values for all those things, your heart and lungs and legs and body, the perfect weight, the perfect day, the best possible time you could run a marathon in was 1:57:58. That blew my mind when I read that paper.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing because, obviously he's done all the work, and it's all calculated in terms of sums, but you might, to the average person, might think, well, that seems just quite arbitrary.
The marathon's arbitrary. The way we count time is arbitrary. And I don't think there's anything more arbitrary about saying this is absolutely the limit. What was interesting about talking to Mike is he keeps saying to himself, well, if we're only at 2:02:57, which is the world record now, maybe there are other factors that I didn't think about. Because human beings are not just pure physiology. And, the marathon is definitely not just a question of what human beings can do. There are all sorts of different factors that go into how fast you can run.
Roger Bannister, you mentioned earlier the 4-minute mile. He's the first man to do it, 1954. It seems like an awfully long time ago. The next month, though, Jim Peters posted a new marathon best, didn't he, of 2:17. The current record, as you mentioned, is 2:02:57, set by Dennis Kimeto, is that right, of
That's
Kenya?
Right. Yeah.
In Berlin.
Yeah.
And his performance shaved 27 seconds off the previous record. Let's have a listen to what Dennis said after that race.
I am feeling good because I put the world record up. No, I am really happy. The training was so good.
Yeah, it was all cool. You're feeling well, yeah?
Yeah, feeling well.
Fair play to him. A 2-hour marathon would mean running every single mile at a pace of 4:35. That's mind-boggling stress on the body.
It's crazy. And it made me smile so much just listening to that clip of Dennis, because I've been in the training camp with him and a stable of other absolutely phenomenal athletes. And if you think watching him run a marathon is exceptional at that pace, you should see these guys in training. And the only way for me to see them in training on the dirt roads around Kenya is to ride a 50cc motorbike, because they're going so fast when they're doing their intervals that they actually overtake the motorbike that I'm on. The motorbike can't go any faster. These guys can. So Dennis, hearing him talk there, he's a very taciturn guy, and that's probably about the most excited you're ever going to hear Dennis. Just made me so happy, because it took me back to some amazing scenes really in Kenya watching these guys train.
Tell me about that. What was that like, and the first time that you headed out? Tell me about how it felt and what the vistas were like. And
it's just an exceptional place. I mean, you know, the main character of my book is a guy called Geoffrey Mutai, who ran 2:03:02 in Boston in 2011. And Geoffrey invited me to his camp where he trains with Dennis Kimetto, and it's miles away from anywhere. It's 20 minutes drive from the nearest tarmac road. And when I was there, you know, for long periods, you know, Geoffrey Mutai, who was a millionaire, washed out of a bucket. He lived in a very simple cottage. He ate very simple food. Everything was just as straightforward and as limiting, really, to excitement and, you know, your normal everyday enjoyment as it could be. They just live to run. They run at dawn, they run at 9 o'clock, they run again in the evening. And then in between that, they eat and they sleep and they wash and they tell each other silly stories while they're sunbathing. And that's it. You know, their life is completely to do with running. And the reason why they're up in the mountains 20 minutes from the nearest tarmac road is because there's no distractions. The whole thing is to make yourself just a temple, to completely subjugate yourself to running. And it's just a beautiful thing to watch, because actually the countryside is gorgeous. You'd never go there as a tourist, but it's deep reds and oranges of the dirt roads and the real deep greens of the bulrushes and the grass on the side of the roads. And it's, you know, it's farming country, but it's pretty poor farming country. And there's just no reason why you'd ever go there unless you were like me and interested in the greatest runners on earth. And the views, once you get to the edges of the Rift Valley with birds circling in the thermals and Shark's Tooth Cliffs, that is just something I will never forget. And it's what kept me coming back, you know, the stories of these incredible guys, this beautiful working environment where all these people were just doing their damnedest to really do something with their lives. It was very, very inspiring to me, and I hope could be inspiring to, you know, people who can experience it secondhand through the book.
it's a world away, I'm sure, from the way most Europeans train. Tell us a little bit more about Geoffrey, because there's a piece where you speak about his first win. He won a bicycle and he narrowly avoided being murdered on the way home.
That's right. So I don't know how much people know about Kenya's recent history, but they had this very turbulent period after the 2007 elections where there was essentially a dispute about who had won. And the dispute ran largely along tribal lines. And where the Kenyan running country is to the west of the Rift Valley. And that's a disputed territory, has been historically, between Kalenjin, who are Geoffrey's people, and Kikuyu, who have traditionally lived further south but have land up there. And there were these awful battles, really. And there was, you know, the pillaging of villages. And Geoffrey had this bicycle that he'd won as first prize in a local race. And he was trying to get back to his grandfather's place from the training camp. And he got into this town and the houses were all on fire and there were groups of men with machetes going from house to house. And the way he describes it was the only way he could survive was to pretend he was something that he wasn't. So he spoke in a very soft voice, pretended he was a schoolboy trying to get home to his grandparents. And he spoke some Kikuyu because he'd been at school further south in Kikuyu country. And fortunately, a policeman stepped in and said, this boy's just a Kikuyu. He's a young boy. He's got nothing to do with this conflict. Please let him through. And he found out later that day that a young Kalenjin boy had been killed in that village. So his life was really hanging by a thread at that moment. And 2 months later, he won his first professional race in Monaco, the Monaco Marathon. And I think stories like that really made me feel like when you hear about a Premiership footballer, you know, crashing his car because He didn't get his extra £5,000 a week or whatever it is. You know, Joffrey sacrificed almost everything to be a runner. And every time he goes on the start line, it's a blessing. And that's why when you hear Dennis Kimetto saying, I'm happy, happy, you know, he really is happy, happy. And not just because he's broken the world record, because he's running the race. The toughest part of Dennis Kimetto's life was not winning that race. It was getting to the start line.
Fascinating.
Ed Caesar's new book is called 2 Hours, The Quest to Run the Impossible Marathon.